They were laughing so hard that one of them nearly knocked over his drink. I heard it from the hallway outside the back office of Hartwell Steakhouse, where my family had reserved the private dining room for my son's rehearsal dinner. I had stepped away from the table to take a call from my accountant. Nothing urgent, just a question about the quarterly filing for my lumber business. I was walking back when I heard the voices. Two men, talking low, but not low enough. "She has no idea," one of them said. And then a laugh. "She thinks he loves her. It's almost sad." That was a different voice. Younger, a little drunk, and then the first voice. Again my future son-in-law's voice. I recognized it immediately. "The property alone is worth $2.4 million. Once we're married, I give it 6 months, maybe 8. Then she signs, and we're done." More laughter. I stood there in that hallway with my phone still warm in my hand, and I did not move for a very long time. My name is Gerald. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a timber and land management company in northern Oregon, mostly in the Willamette Valley. My wife, Carol, passed away 11 years ago from a stroke. She was 54. We had 2 children together, our son, Thomas, and our daughter, Melissa. Melissa is 31. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which I mean entirely as a compliment. She graduated from the University of Oregon, came back to help me run the business for a few years, then went out on her own and started a landscape architecture firm in Portland. She has done well. She is the kind of person who plans everything down to the last detail, who keeps a paper calendar on her desk even though she has every app you can imagine on her phone, who calls me every Sunday morning without fail. She had been dating a man named Brandon for about 14 months when she told me she was engaged. I want to be fair here. When I first met Brandon, I did not dislike him. He was polished, 40 years old, well-dressed, said all the right things. He told me he worked in commercial real estate development, that he had projects underway in Bend and in Eugene. He shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye. He brought a good bottle of wine the first time he came to dinner. Melissa was happy in a way I had not seen her be happy in years. After a difficult breakup in her late 20s, she had become guarded, careful. To see her laughing easily, reaching over to touch this man's arm, telling me about trips they were planning, it meant something to me. I told myself I was being a protective father. I told myself to relax. But there were small things, nothing I could point to exactly. The way he would ask questions about the business that felt like more than casual interest. How many acres total? Is the timber tract under a conservation easement or is it free title? What does your exit plan look like? He framed it as admiration, as getting to know me. I answered his questions. I was friendly. I told myself that a man in real estate development would naturally think this way, would naturally want to understand assets and structures. But I noticed, and then I heard him in that hallway, and I understood what I had been noticing all along. I did not go back into the dining room right away. I walked to the far end of the hall and stood near the emergency exit and breathed through my nose the way my doctor has told me to do when my blood pressure climbs. In, slow. Out, slow. I thought about Melissa in there at that table, probably wondering where I had gone, probably checking her phone. I thought about Carol and what she would have done. Carol would have walked back into that room and looked at Brandon with those calm gray eyes of hers and said something so precise and so measured that he would have understood exactly how much trouble he was in without her raising her voice even slightly. I always said Carol could cut glass with a look. I am not Carol. I am louder and more impulsive, and I have made more mistakes by acting fast than by acting slow. So I made myself wait. I made myself think. I went back inside. I sat down. I smiled at my daughter and told her the accountant call had run long, sorry. I shook Brandon's hand when we said goodnight. I drove home alone and I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning. The next day I called a man named Roy Sutter. Roy and I have known each other for 22 years. He used to be an investigator with the Oregon State Police, Financial Crimes Division. He retired early and went private. He is the kind of man who finds out things that other people have decided you don't need to know. He is not cheap, and I have never cared. I told him what I heard. I told him everything I could remember about Brandon, full name Brandon Keith Alford, age 40, said he lived in a condo in the Pearl District, said he worked for a company called Cascade Summit Development. Roy listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Give me 2 weeks." He called back in 9 days. What Roy found was not a single smoking gun. It was a pattern. And patterns, as Roy explained to me that afternoon on the phone, are often more damning than any one piece of evidence because they show intention rather than accident. Brandon Keith Alford had been engaged before. Twice, to be specific, in the previous 7 years. The first was a woman in Scottsdale, Arizona, a 43-year-old veterinarian who owned her practice outright and had inherited a commercial property from her parents. That engagement ended abruptly about 10 months in. The woman had filed a civil complaint later, withdrawn, alleging that Brandon had pressured her to add him to the deed of her commercial property as a condition of moving forward with the wedding. The second was a woman in Sacramento, a 50-year-old business owner, a chain of 3 dry cleaning shops that had been in her family for decades. That relationship ended after 13 months. No complaint filed. But Roy had spoken to someone who knew her, and the story was almost identical: pressure around property transfer, pressure around jointly held assets, a sudden departure when she pushed back. Cascade Summit Development existed. It was a registered LLC in Oregon. But it had no employees other than Brandon, and no completed projects on record. It had a professional website and a rented office address in Bend that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. Roy also found something more recent. 4 months before Brandon met Melissa, before they were introduced through mutual friends at a gallery opening in Portland, Brandon had attended a charity gala associated with the Oregon Timber Association. My company had been a sponsor of that gala for 6 consecutive years. My name, my company's name, our approximate land holdings, all of that was in the program. He had targeted my daughter deliberately. He had done research. He had positioned himself to meet her. I sat with that information for 3 days before I decided what to do next. During those 3 days, I went to work every morning and I answered my emails, and I had dinner with Thomas and his fiancée, who is a wonderful woman, and who was the reason we were all gathering that week, and I said nothing to anyone. I also called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Hale, who has handled my business affairs for 14 years. I did not tell her everything yet. I asked her a question. If someone were to present a land transfer agreement to a family member of mine for signature, what would make that agreement legally unenforceable? Patricia paused. Then she said, "Gerald, what's going on?" I told her. She was quiet for longer this time. "Come in tomorrow morning," she said. I met with Patricia for 2 hours. We talked through several scenarios. We talked about what Roy had found and what it meant and what it didn't yet prove. We talked about the difference between what I knew and what I could demonstrate. We talked about what Melissa might do if I simply told her what I knew. That last part was the hardest, because here's what I understood about my daughter. Melissa does not respond well to being managed. She never has, from the time she was a little girl. If you tell Melissa what to think, she will think the opposite, out of principle. If you tell her someone is bad for her, she will defend that person with everything she has. It is the same quality that makes her extraordinary. At her work, she will not be pushed around. She will not be told what to do, but it meant that if I walked into her house and said, "Your fiancé is a con man who researched you before he ever met you," she would not believe me. She would believe him. She would call me overprotective and paranoid, and she would pull further away, and I would lose the ability to help her at all. Patricia and I came up with a different approach. We would give Brandon exactly what he was looking for, or what he thought he was looking for. Here is how it worked. I asked Melissa to come to dinner at my house, just the 2 of us, and I told her that I had been thinking about my estate planning, and that I wanted to walk her through some changes I was considering. This was true. I do review my estate documents every few years, and Melissa was aware of this. She came on a Wednesday evening, and I made her mother's pot roast, which is the one meal I can cook without anything going wrong, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I showed her some documents. I told her I was thinking about transferring a portion of the Eastern Timber Tract, approximately 340 acres, into a family trust that she would co-administer. I told her I was still working through the details with Patricia, but that I wanted her input. I told her I thought it made sense, given that she was getting married and starting a new chapter. Melissa was touched. She asked good questions about the structure. She told me I didn't have to do anything on her account, that she didn't need it. I told her that was exactly why I wanted to do it. What I did not tell her was that the documents I showed her were drafts that Patricia and I had prepared specifically for this conversation, documents that appeared to describe a transfer of the Eastern Tract, but that contained technical language which, as Patricia had explained to me carefully, would make any subsequent transfer of that property to a third party within 5 years legally void, without explicit trustee approval from both me and a named independent trustee, a role I had assigned to a retired judge Patricia knew well. In plain terms, if Brandon somehow convinced Melissa to sign anything related to that land, it would be worthless. The actual property was protected separately and was not going anywhere. But Brandon did not know that. He only knew because I expected Melissa would tell him, which she did, because she was excited. And he asked how the dinner went that Gerald was planning to move 340 acres of timberland into a trust with Melissa's name on it. 340 acres in the Willamette Valley, at current timberland values. Roy told me later that Brandon had made 3 phone calls within 24 hours of that dinner. One to his friend, the same voice I had heard in the hallway at Hartwell Steakhouse. 2 to a number Roy traced to a real estate attorney in Bend who had represented Cascade Summit Development before. He was already moving. Over the following 6 weeks, Brandon became very interested in the wedding timeline. He had previously agreed with Melissa that they were in no rush, that a spring wedding the following year made sense, that there was plenty of time to plan properly. Now he started raising the idea of moving everything up. December, maybe, or even a small ceremony in October, just family. They could do the bigger celebration later. He told Melissa he was just so eager to start their life together that waiting felt pointless. He also started asking questions about the trust documents. He framed it as wanting to understand the family's finances so he could plan intelligently, contribute appropriately. He was careful about it. Never pushy, always loving, and reasonable in tone. He asked Melissa if she'd had a chance to review the full documents with Patricia. He asked if there was anything that needed to be done before the wedding to ensure the transfer went through cleanly. Melissa mentioned some of this to me on our Sunday calls. She didn't think much of it. She told me that Brandon just liked to be organized, liked to have things in order. I said that sounded reasonable. I said he seemed like a very thorough person. I said this while sitting at my kitchen table with Roy's updated notes in front of me and Patricia's number on speed dial. In the 5th week, Brandon made his move. He told Melissa that he had been speaking with his attorney, the one in Bend, and that the attorney had raised some concerns about the trust structure from a tax efficiency standpoint. He said he didn't want to overstep, but that he had some thoughts about an alternative approach that might actually be better for Melissa in the long run. He asked if she would be willing to look at a document his attorney had prepared, just to consider it. The document, which Melissa brought to me without him knowing she was going to, proposed removing the independent trustee structure entirely and replacing co-administration rights with what was described as a simplified joint tenancy arrangement that would give a spouse full transfer authority upon marriage. In other words, once they were married, he could move the property wherever he wanted without anyone's approval but his own. Melissa handed me the document over coffee in my kitchen on a Sunday morning, the same morning she usually called me. She had driven up from Portland. She sat across from me and she said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I put the document down. I looked at her. "Is this normal?" she asked. "The stuff Brandon's attorney is suggesting. Is that a real thing people do, or does this seem wrong to you?" And there it was. I had been waiting for her to ask, not hoping she wouldn't notice, not planning to force the issue, waiting for her to see it herself, because Melissa had to arrive at this on her own. Any other way, and she would have defended him. I told her to call Patricia. Patricia spent 45 minutes on the phone with Melissa that morning, while I sat in the living room and looked out the window at the Douglas firs at the back of my property. When Melissa came back in, her face was very still. She sat down across from me again. "How long have you known?" she said. I told her about the hallway at Hartwell Steakhouse. I told her about Roy. I told her about the women in Scottsdale and Sacramento. I told her about the charity gala, about how he had found her, about the timeline Roy had put together. She did not cry right away. She sat very straight and she listened to everything. She asked 3 or 4 specific questions, dates, details, and I answered them. When I was done, she stood up and walked to the kitchen window and stood there for a while with her back to me. Then she said, "He picked me on purpose." "Yes," I said. He researched us. He researched you. He went to that gala specifically to find someone connected to this family. That's what Roy believes. Yes. She was quiet for another long moment. I told him about Mom, she said. Her voice was very low. I told him about her practice, how I came back to help you after she died. I told him things I don't tell most people. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She turned around. Her eyes were red, but she was not crying. She said, "What do we do now?" I had already spoken with Patricia about this. I had also spoken with a detective at the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit, a contact Roy had connected me with. After Roy determined that the pattern of behavior across 3 states potentially constituted wire fraud and criminal solicitation, we had 2 options. We could end the engagement quietly. Melissa breaks it off. We share the documentation with Brandon privately. He understands the situation and disappears. Clean. No publicity. No trial. Or we could let the authorities handle it, which would be slower, more complicated, and harder on Melissa, but which might protect the next woman he targeted after her. Melissa decided in about 30 seconds. The next woman, she said. We go with the police. That is my daughter. Detective Ingrid Moss at the Portland Police Bureau was thorough and careful. She reviewed Roy's documentation, the documents Brandon's attorney had prepared, the phone records Roy had obtained through legal channels. She contacted her counterparts in Arizona and California. It took another 6 weeks of coordination, during which Melissa continued the engagement with Brandon, answering his messages normally, telling him the wedding planning was coming along, giving him no indication that anything had changed. I do not know how she did that. I do not think I could have. But she did it, and she did it because she understood that if Brandon ran before the authorities were ready, the case would be much harder to make. The morning the detective was ready to move, Melissa called Brandon and told him she had spoken with her father and that she was ready to proceed with modifying the trust documents the way his attorney had suggested. She told him she thought he was right that the tax structure could be simplified. She told him she wanted to meet that afternoon, just the 2 of them and their respective attorneys, to finalize everything before the wedding. He agreed immediately. He set the meeting for 2 o'clock. Patricia was at the table. I was not. On Detective Moss's advice, my presence might have signaled something was wrong. Melissa sat across from Brandon and his attorney in a conference room at Patricia's office in Salem. The modified documents were on the table. Brandon's attorney walked through them. Patricia asked several clarifying questions, slowly, methodically. Brandon was patient. He was charming. He put his hand over Melissa's at one point and said he just wanted everything to be right for her. When Melissa reached for the pen, Patricia said, "Before we finalize, I do want to make sure everyone understands the scope of what's being transferred here." And she began to describe in detail the other properties, the business assets, the equipment, things that had never been mentioned in any prior conversation with Brandon or his attorney. Brandon's attorney started taking notes very fast. Brandon said, "I wasn't aware of," and then he stopped. He looked at Melissa. She looked back at him, and she said, "I know about the woman in Scottsdale. I know about Sacramento. I know about the gala." The conference room was very quiet. Detective Moss and another officer were in the hallway. They came in about 45 seconds later. I was in the parking lot, sitting in my truck, with the heat running, even though it wasn't particularly cold. Patricia called me when it was done. She said, "It went fine. Melissa is okay." I sat there for a few minutes after I hung up. I watched a sparrow land on the concrete barrier at the edge of the lot, look around at nothing in particular, and fly away. Brandon was charged with criminal solicitation, attempted fraud, and 2 additional counts coordinated with authorities in Arizona and California. His attorney in Bend lost his license pending investigation for his role in preparing the transfer documents. The case took 14 months to fully resolve. Brandon ultimately entered a plea agreement and received a 3-year sentence, with additional civil liability to the woman in Scottsdale who had previously withdrawn her complaint and was now willing to pursue it with the new evidence. Melissa did not attend the sentencing. She said she had already finished with it long before then, and that watching a proceeding wasn't going to change what she felt. She was already deep in a new project, a large residential landscape installation on the coast, and she was where she wanted to be, which was working. She calls me every Sunday. She drove up last month and we raked the leaves off the back acre together, the two of us. The same way we used to do it when she was a teenager and complained the whole time. She didn't complain this time. She put on her old work gloves and she raked leaves for 3 hours without saying much, and then we sat on the back porch and had coffee and watched it get dark. At one point she said, "I should have seen it." I said, "He was very good at what he did." She thought about that for a minute. "Yeah," she said. "But you were better." I don't know that I agree with that. I did not outthink anyone. I made one phone call to Roy, and then I waited for my daughter to trust her own instincts, because I knew that was the only thing that was ever going to work. The instincts were hers. The courage was hers. All I did was make sure the door was open when she was ready to walk through it. Carol would have done the same. Probably faster, and with considerably better delivery. The Eastern Timber Tract is still in the family trust. 340 acres of second-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar. The same land my father walked before me. It will be Melissa's someday, fully and without condition, when she's ready for it, and not one day before. Nobody is getting within 100 miles of it without Patricia, and that retired judge signing off first. Some things are worth protecting. That's the lesson. That's the whole lesson. Not the legal documents, not the investigation, not any of the mechanics of what we did. The lesson is that the people in your life who love you will protect you, even when you don't know you need protecting. And when the moment comes that you do see it, when you turn around and realize what they've been doing and why the right thing to do is pick up a rake and show up on a Sunday afternoon and work beside them until it gets dark. That's it. That's everything. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. And if you know someone who might need to hear it, share it with them. Sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the right time.